Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Nick Down, and excuse me, my name is Nick Down, and I am Program Officer with the Trustee and Government Affairs Department at the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. Again, thank you so much for being here for this afternoon's webinar, Spending for Student Success, Effective Strategies for College Governing Boards to Control Costs. For those of you who might be joining us for the first time, a very special welcome. And for those who have joined us before and have seen and have viewed past webinars, welcome back. Okay. Now, before I turn it over to Armand, I do just a small housekeeping announcement that at the end of today's discussion, we will be, the panelists will be available to answer any questions you may have. You can, we ask that you submit your questions at any time during the Q&A at the very bottom of your screen in the Q&A box. With that in mind, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to ACTA's Vice President for Trustee and Government Affairs, Armand Alacbay.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you all for joining us today. We named this program Spending for Student Success because ACTA believes that one of the most important responsibilities of college leaders and public fiduciaries is to make sure that the institution's educational mission remains paramount in allocating precious financial resources. The COVID-19 pandemic continues to loom over every sector of the global economy, and higher education is no exception. But overlapping with this uncertainty are other considerations, such as forthcoming demographic changes, a 25% drop in prospective freshmen starting in 2025, and an American public beleaguered by $1.7 trillion in student loan debt, desperate for answers. A Gallup poll last spring found that nearly half now of parents of young children in the US would prefer their child to pursue something other than a four-year college degree after high school. ACTA has long supported higher education leaders in their efforts to make college more affordable and accessible through responsible, engaged governance. 2 years ago, we launched the website howcollegesspendmoney.com, an interactive tool that allows users to benchmark institutional spending trends against those of their peers, using data from the Department of Education of over 1,500 four-year colleges and universities. Just last month, we released a report, The Cost of Excess, which looked at financial data from 1,500 institutions since the Great Recession. We found that during the last major economic crisis, in the aggregate, increases in institutional spending put upward pressure on tuition, even after controlling for levels of state funding. Worst of all, we found that this came with only marginal benefit to students in the form of graduation rates. Close fiscal oversight is more than just about smart accounting. It is about giving future generations the opportunity to avail themselves of the single most effective means of economic mobility, a college education, while still letting American higher education maintain the independence and autonomy it has had for centuries. I'm excited for today's discussion. We have quite the distinguished panel this afternoon. Congressman Tom Davis is currently a partner at Holland Knight, previously having served the 11th Congressional District of Virginia, my district, from 1995 until 2008, and also served as Rector of George Mason University's Board of Visitors. Amy Jones is the Director for Education and Human Services Policy for the U.S. House Committee on Education and Labor. Dave Walsh is the former president of Mitsubishi Hitachi Power Systems Americas Incorporated, and most recently served on the University of Central Florida Board of Trustees. Finally, James Toscano is the president of Partners for College Affordability and Public Trust, with whom we are co-hosting this webinar. Welcome, everybody, and really just want to jump in with one question for everybody. How much of the student debt problem, in your opinion, is because of institutional spending choices?
Armand, Dave Walsh here. I can kick that off if you wish. If one looks historically at the cost of attending, the cost of matriculating, tuition fees, room and board at especially public institutions, from, for example, 1976 or 1980 to now, being 2.4 times the rise in inflation since that time. Again, 2.4 times more escalation of costs than tuition and fees. Things like decisions to devote to research that turns out to be largely non-funded is one issue that has been a tremendous cost adder, as the philosophy of many state institutions has migrated over to wanting to become tier one research institutions. At many cases at the expense of undergraduates. Undergraduate tuition and fee costs bear the largest burden of unfunded research. That's a big one. Administrative cost exploded is certainly another one. Staff additions in a wide variety of roles, administrative SVPs, AVPs, and growth in tenured faculty, again, for non-funded research, do wind up being probably a very large institutional conscious decision to increase cost and shift in areas of endeavor, again, non-funded research, and have those costs, at the end of the day, be borne by undergraduates. So to the extent that winds up in student debt, absolutely, because that is what funds.
How's it square with everyone else's experiences?
So I'd like to share an experience that I had recently with the president of Prairie View A&M University. That is an HBCU in Texas. It's part of the Texas A&M system. And the president there, Dr. Ruth Simmons, said to me something very interesting that I think is relevant to this question. And that is, quote, "One of the great challenges for educational leadership is to try and be consistent in our messages. On the one hand," she says, "you can't argue that the cost, the internal rate of inflation, is such that you have no choice but to raise tuition, and then have people see that what is creating all that pressure on the internal rate of inflation is the kind of decisions you're making." So yes, the student debt problem is complicated, and there are a variety of factors that's driving student debt. But institutional spending absolutely affects the bottom line. Many of those budget expenditures get passed on in the form of tuition, which might ultimately be paid by student debt. And so Dr. Simmons, I think, is really right that it's not just the reality of the institutional spending decisions that are driving tuition and perhaps student debt, but the importance of the perception of those things, that the public perception is that what's going on college campuses is over the top, especially during a pandemic where folks need to be tightening their belts. And
so, Congressman Davis, you've seen this from two different perspectives, both as a public official and also serving on a governing board from the institutional side. I mean, did you see your role differently in any way, or does that? I mean, how do those two roles shape your perspective on this issue?
Is that to me?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, first of all, in a congressional or legislative role, you're looking at everything. You're looking at students. You're looking at appropriations, the kind of things that drive in a macro level what's happening at education. But when you're focused on an institution, you really get inside to see how things work, and you're focused institutionally, how do you make this thing work? I learned a lot in my 8 years as a board member at George Mason and 6 as rector in terms of internally, what can we do to tighten things within our institution, things I never would have seen as a member of Congress, where you're more likely to throw money at in an appropriation into a certain billet to be spent in a certain way. But once you get down the university, you're driven by the bottom line. What tuition increase are you going to be allowed to make, or do you dare make at this point and stay competitive? How do you keep paying good people? At George Mason, we're the highest price area in the state. We have the lowest reimbursement per student, and yet we're 40,000 students. We've maintained a tier 1 university research brand. We've had a couple Nobel Prize winners. When you get on the inside, you see how much an institution is making or broken by their leadership, and how they are able to turn things around and make tough decisions within that institution. So that was the difference to me.
So, Amy, today, so big picture as far as what is the congressional outlook right now as far as higher education spending? What's the framework that our viewers should be looking at this, at least as far as Congress's perspective?
Sure. So we're in this kind of interesting place right now where we just moved a very large reconciliation bill through the committee that in a very partisan manner, knowing full well that this thing that just passed is not, or that at least passed through committee and is on its way to the budget committee right now, is never going to become law because of what we've heard from the Senate. It had significant spending in it. In addition, we've had significant spending that has been thrown at schools through a multitude of COVID relief bills with very little, kind of purposely at the beginning, I would say, because we just didn't know when we were writing the CARES Act in a bipartisan fashion, we didn't know what needs were. And so we wanted to be trying to be as helpful as we could while still trying to maintain, some guardrails. But what we're, hearing and seeing now across many of these different areas, not just higher education, is that folks have gotten so much money that it is becoming difficult for them to spend it in a targeted way or in a way that makes sense, frankly. And so that has been really frightening and disappointing. I think you do have a lot of members still talking. I mean, we've had members that have been talking about this for years and years in terms of what colleges are spending their money on and how they're spending it and why they're spending it. And we've held hearings even where we've had some really good actors, where to the point that I think Mr. Davis was making, that colleges have taken really unsexy topics and reformed them and actually saved money and been able to keep their costs down for their students. And so I think it can be done for those that want to do it, but it takes a lot of push in order to be able to do that. We have members that talk very frequently with similar experiences who used to sit on boards of their colleges and things like that, talking about administrative bloat and trying to, funnel dollars, as many dollars as can be had into, either faculty or instructional, rather than just building a new center or building out a particular school with, officer for this, that, and the other thing across the board. So it is definitely a hot topic of conversation. How we go about it is always up for debate. We have ebbed and flowed in Congress about, and with Republicans and Democrats, frankly, on what the role of the federal government is in terms of holding colleges accountable for their costs. Dr. Fox certainly believes that we should be holding colleges accountable, generally speaking, whether it's for their costs or their outcomes. I mean, really all of it. And how we go about that is, especially when we're spending so much money, recognizing that the money technically flows with the student, not in many cases, not to the institutions. There are some obvious examples where the money does go to institutions directly, and there's a much more difficult or a much more strong tie between the federal government and the schools. But with federal student aid basically being a voucher, we try to be thoughtful about what that means. But we've had examples across the board where we've taken more aggressive action and where we've taken kind of less aggressive action on the cost piece in particular. I think given the amount of money that is going out the door, both in terms of federal spending and then also the amount that students are having to borrow to go to school, and also that combined with the fact that employers are finally starting to speak up and are finally starting to realize that maybe you don't need a baccalaureate degree for all the jobs, for every job, and that maybe that they can hire someone that has gone to a shorter term program or that has graduated from a community college or that has even just taken some community college courses because they have the skills that are necessary to do the job. I think that's all going to put additional pressure on schools, and there's going to be a big push for accountability and whenever we get to reauthorization.
So speaking of accountability at the institutional level, Dave, this question's for you. You served on the UCF board for many years, and I've talked about how difficult it is to say no sometimes to a proposed expenditure that may be popular but perhaps questionable. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, if anyone in our audience is thinking about being a trustee or is in the middle of being a trustee, that there's this balancing act between up the institution and be a promoter of the institution is of course part of the role, but a larger part of the role is actually government, because the board is the last stop between cogent financial decision making on fiscal management processes and prioritization of spending and strategy that often you discover that management in these institutions, unless they're Mitch Daniels, for example, with a heavy management background, really aren't equipped to deal with based on their background. It tends to be more academic. So the role of the board to be objective and board members willing to be involved in fiscal management processes, thinking about, if I focus on state institutions, tend to be in their minds underfunded. So then when you look at core mission spending versus non-core mission spending might be a water park, might be a solar farm, might be a power plant, might be in the next parking lot that private sector investors will be happy to come in and invest in a partnership basis, and shift the focus of boards and institutional management to expend the resources they have on mission one. And that's crisp and effective education to the undergraduate population and later the graduate population. And then maybe after that, once a lot of success is attained on research, but kind of to think through strategy and think through things objectively and have the ability to say no. Board positions do in most states have the unique ability to go in and do research on specific topical matter unimpeded, meaning a certain spending plan that you want to look at. You, as a board member, you can go in, generally speaking, and ask as many questions as you want offline, outside of the board meetings, discover what you want to discover about a topic prior to being asked to vote. That's a unique advantage to being a board member. And one who does invest the time to do those things can be effective in the background, as well as, when things don't go well in those meetings, to be able to periodically revector the institution and vote no on issues that make limited sense financially. So the governance role and the objectivity role, you be trained by management to not be objective and to be all up the institution and want to be supportive of it. But the reality is, when you look at most all state statutes, your role is to be in a governance mode and be the last chance kid, if you will, to say no to things that just don't make sense given the academic mission and what the strategy should actually be. So that's a quick summary.
So, James, you've done some case study research recently on governing boards that have been intentional and quite effective at controlling costs. Could you share some of your findings and just your reflections on that?
Thank you. And I want to thank ACTA for their collaboration on that project that we call the best practices on college affordability for trustees. And it is an attempt to begin to kind of look out, do a landscape study, a bit of crowdsourcing of strategies that institutions across the country are using to solve affordability problems. There is absolutely not a one size fits all here. And so we're trying to organize those things. But I had the great fortune as part of this project to interview more than 24 college presidents, board chairs, other members of governing boards, cabinet members, and we saw some common things across the institutions that we looked at. And one I would say is that board members at these institutions play a very important role. They do not see themselves, they do not see their role as, what we might see in the industry as more of a cheerleader, right? The idea that, if you're asked to be part of a board, that your principal responsibility is to cheer on the college president and make sure that, that they are as supported as possible in every decision that they make. To the contrary, the institutions that we studied and their governing boards, they had a deep sense of responsibility that, that is, especially when it came to budgeting, and if they had tuition and fee setting authority, that it was their job, it was their responsibility. So there was a lot of ownership of responsibility. I think accountability is certainly a good word for it, especially in a period in higher education coming out of the Great Recession, that where there was all this discussion around states that, there was disinvestment in state higher education institutions from state legislatures, and that the institutions would quickly say, well, that's the reason why our prices have gone up. That's why tuition has gone up, because we're not getting as much money from the state. And the state would basically turn around and say, well, look, it's the institutions who are making all these decisions. You know, we still spend a lot on higher education. And so the boards that we spoke to, they're not in that blame game. They don't point fingers back at the legislature and say, it's the legislature's fault for not giving us enough money. That's why our prices are up. These folks are not involved in a blame game. They're very accountable. Data transparency is a big commonality we saw across these institutions. So whether that's the Florida Scoreboard Initiative at the Florida Board of Governors, where it is a consumer-friendly dashboard. It's not one of these, it's not like iPads where you've got to be a scientist to go in and dig out the data in the first place. It's a consumer-oriented dashboard that shows people the important metrics of the Florida State University system, whether it's the Data Palooza event that they hold in the Texas A&M University system, where all the college presidents are brought to the same room for at least a day, and they're engaged. They're engaged in all of their metrics in a very transparent way with the Texas A&M University System Board. So those are some of the things that we found, and then we'll get the chance later to talk about individual strategies that different colleges and universities are employing to help tackle affordability problems.
So there are a lot of issues in there that to unpack. I mean, the relationship between board members at a public university and the legislature, or just even the culture of what a public governing board is and how they view their responsibilities. So I want to direct this question to the folks here who have been on public university boards, and Congressman Davis, I'd like to start with you. What did you see in your experience as far as the kind of what the board did right in terms of engaging in good governance, good relationships with the legislature, but also fiscal prudence among all? Congressman, there you go.
Yeah, the buck stopped with us. We had seen previous cycles where we blamed the legislature for not sending us enough money, giving us the lowest reimbursement in the state. We continued our outreach to the state, but we basically went to the state and said, give us the flexibility to solve this on our own. And so we upped our fundraising, if you will, in some cases. We had to trim the staff. We did what we needed to do to make things work for our students and for the institutions. You'll find that when everybody hunkers down together and gets in a problem-solving mode about how do we keep tuition affordable, how do we continue to deliver the quality of education people are expecting, that you can do some pretty innovative things. But you've got to reinvent yourself. You've got to reinvent the dining halls. You've got to reinvent all of the intramural activities that students are paying for with their fees. You've got to take a look at how you use your adjuncts. There's not one answer. Every school's got, I think, different dynamics that they need to look at. But in our particular case, we said, how do we make this thing work and continue to make it work? We picked up at George Mason 60% of the growth over the last 10 years of university students in the state. 60% of the growth with the lowest reimbursement in the state and the highest cost of living in the state, still trying to make that work. We had to up our fundraising activities significantly, and we ended up doing things we never thought we wouldn't have done if we didn't have to. They say necessity is the mother of invention. And we reinvented ourselves many times over, but the board pulled together. We got some naming grants that we hadn't expected, but we went out and were able to find it. And the board just pulled together, recognizing that we were in dire straits. And the end result has, I think, been a real success story.
Thank you. And Dave, your experience.
Well, I would like to go back on one aspect of data reporting. Even the consistent reporting of data, the accurate reporting of data, as a board member, you've got to be willing to challenge when you see, I mean, we get heavily into, at my urging, at my institution, the instructional cost per student, good data that ACTA tracks by institution nationally. That's a tremendous deficiency. And academic or instructional cost per student, that after 2 years of questioning, suddenly the academic cost per student went up 30%. And then you get into, okay, the why. So how did that happen? Oh, a lot of reclassified expenses wound up in that measure because someone was calling attention to it. Another area, even the size of the endowment, an institution that may want to be constantly pleading with the state for money can be motivated to use tactics possibly to understate its endowment. Things of this nature happen. Research costs can be, and I've seen maneuvered or restated and reclassified to be lower using tactics such as having researchers, tenured researchers, zoom into a undergraduate class for 2 hours a semester to begin to transfer a lot of their costs to instructional when really it's not. So I'm just reminding that even this is, also happens in private enterprise a lot. Data can and is manipulated, can be and is, and you've got to be really looking very hard at the data you're being given, especially when it begins to fluctuate a lot in the direction you kind of want it to, the whys of how's that happening. These things do need evaluated case by case when you get into the numbers being presented by management and institutions. And again, that's part of the tough duty, the tough business of governing.
So, Amy, you're hearing a lot today about we're hearing a lot right now about just the various challenges and the different environments that individual boards have, colleges, universities, and I mean, these are just 2 or 3 out of thousands of stories across the country. So, bring it back to just the nation and the big picture of higher education spending. What do you see the federal government doing as far as the review of what accountability should look like in terms of this?
So as I mentioned earlier, we have fluctuated in terms of kind of directly going after college costs. A number of years ago, Chairman Buck McKeon, who was a Republican from California, directly went after college costs and said that any college whose price increased a certain amount over, I think, inflation, or I think that was the index, had to do all sorts of reporting and figure out how to kind of lower it. I think there are definitely going to be proposals that look at things like that. I think there are going to be proposals, and have been proposals, around risk sharing, with the idea that if schools are taking all of the money from federal student aid, that they have to share in some of the risk. That's not directly related to college costs per se, but does try to get at what Congress is doing to hold schools more accountable. We've certainly looked at kind of loan repayment rates and looking at repayment on the back end. I mean, a lot of the things that because of this dynamic about kind of ebbing and flowing about how comfortable folks feel with the federal government going directly after costs, a lot of the accountability metrics have been more focused around the student aid programs than they have necessarily about costs. You've also seen us, Republicans in particular, try to promote and talk up some of these newer models that are out there. Some of these companies that are kind of breaking down the college degree and trying to help students get skills in less time than what it takes at a school. My boss, Virginia Fox, who's a Republican from North Carolina, won't even call them 4-year institutions anymore because so few students actually graduate in 4 years. It's something that really irritates her, and many of our members also. So the fact that it's taking longer and longer for students to graduate is also a major that contributes to the cost also, obviously. So trying to hold schools accountable for outcomes is also another thing that we look to try and do. We also like to use the bully pulpit quite a bit to highlight either good actors or particularly egregious actors, so that folks can either have good examples of things to follow where you've seen schools kind of reform some of their academic programs based on, and you've seen this a lot, I feel like, with the regional publics who have really worked with their economic development boards or their local workforce investment boards, or the town mayor or whomever is there, and industry that is local, to try and find out what people need from their graduates and actually reformed their programs to meet that, which is something that you'd think schools would do. But in many cases, they don't. They just want to keep teaching the same things and offer the same academic programs and the same majors that they've always done, regardless of whether there's a need for them.
And so the mechanisms here are tricky, really.
Right.
James, you've talked before about how sometimes it just comes down to trustee training and getting them to understand this is what their role is, and that really understand the gravity of their role and how much power they have at the institutional level, because that's where the locus of spending is. Can you talk more about that?
Absolutely. So 9 U.S. states have a trustee training, a statewide policy. It might be within statute that requires a trustee at a given institution to be trained through a formal state training program. And yes, those programs cover the basics of being a trustee. But what we have found is that it really matters. The qualitative part of that training really matters. Not just whether you have a training, but what standard are you training people to? What's important? What are the values that board members bring to their positions as members of governing boards of trustees? And we've heard plenty of those stories where a governor might appoint a trustee, bring them into their office on the as a group and sort of read them the riot act on holding costs down, not increasing tuition. We've heard plenty of those stories, but that's different than what we've seen also in these training programs. Again, 9 U.S. states have them. I will tell you a little bit about Virginia, because our organization has been involved in changing the Virginia training statute. What we have found is it's great that Virginia has had one on the books where board members are required one time before, basically in their first year of trusteeship, to go and be trained on certain subject matters. Once we started digging into the quality of it, and I attended one for a couple of days' time before I opined on it, was that, first, it's dynamic and things are changing in higher education. One training at the beginning of a potential 8-year term is not good enough. Our organization led a change to the Virginia code that required that there's retraining every 2 years. Another thing that we found was that there's no mention of who a board member's duty is to. And this is really important. So we had led a change to the state code where it says now in Virginia training policy that board members have a duty to the public. That's so important, because if your only duty is to the institution and the health of college administrators and such, then you'll never see a tuition increase you didn't like. But if your duty is to the public, then you have different stakeholders to consider when you are facing questions about cost and tuition. So those are some really important things. And I'll just add this one other nugget we found in Virginia. There was no requirement for trustees to even consider or look at or know what the trends on student debt around the country were. We also drove a change to the Virginia law that said that board members have to be trained on student debt patterns, student debt trends across the country. It's really important that boards hear from voices outside of their own bubble. And so we hope that in Virginia, although it's not required by statute, but that they invite dynamic speakers from across the country and other states where they're doing innovative things, and other colleges and universities where innovative things are happening.
So I'm going to kick this question to our trustees. And again, I'll start with Congressman Davis. If you were giving a trustee training, what would the first lesson be about?
First thing we tell our trustees is how to deal with admissions applications, and that there is an appropriate way to handle them, an appropriate way not to handle them. That they're entitled to make a recommendation, and that's as far as it goes in terms of not throwing their weight around. Look, there are so many stakeholders in these areas. When you come to a university, you want the best outcomes for students, so you want to be sensitive about tuition. The faculty basically run the place. And my first faculty meeting, I remember getting up to, and the first question I got before the faculty senate is, when are you going to quit investing in fossil fuels? And my answer is, when the legislature tells me to. That's not my job. My job is to get the best return on our investment so we can pay you and keep tuition low. But you have, as you said, you owe a public duty to the whole community at large, and you are constantly balancing what it takes with the different stakeholders. And that's the students, it's the staff, it's the faculty, and it's the community at large. All of who, in our case, in Northern Virginia, it's all of the prospective people that are going to hire our graduates once they graduate. So it is a real balancing act. I found the trustee training in Virginia to be very helpful. It, I think, put every member as they come into this, instead of being independent agents, I think we had more of a team spirit as we would approach these kind of issues. We encouraged everybody to speak up and ask questions, but just at the end, virtually all of our votes were unanimous, because we were able to talk them out, and we created a spirit around the table where everybody could say what they wanted to say, everybody be given respect, and we generally come to a consensus. The only one we didn't come to a consensus on was the naming of the Scalia Law School, and that was 14-2. So after talking, you can imagine with the name that it had given so many of the Democratic appointees some heartburn, but given the naming grant and everything else. But the trustee training was critical for us. But I think the most difficult part is, how do you balance the needs of what the public? Who is the public? Who do you represent? And every trustee, I think, looks at it a little bit differently. But at the end of the day, being able to discuss these things around the table, have a thorough discussion of what's good for the region, what's good for the university as an institution, what's good for the students, what's good for the faculty, and everything else. I think we were able to work them out.
And Dave, what about you? How, if you were leading this, what would you be telling your incoming trustees?
Well, if I could stay focused on the training topic, in my particular state, up to this point, unfortunately, unlike Virginia and the good comments James made, the training at this point remains delegated to the universities to train the trustees that are supposed to be governing them. That leads to the use of consultants like the American governing boards, who are very much aligned with university managements and the way of thinking that it's okay that these places are run by their faculty to do most of the training on behalf of management. And you can see the oxymoron with that occurring. That kind of training provides no objectivity. To the extent that it's done by the state and on behalf of the primary paying constituents, boards generally represent, in whether the private sector or the government sector, should represent the interest of the paying constituents, being the state government, being the students, being the mums and dads who fund the students, being the funding sources. They don't really, except I was on the board of some companies in China 25 years ago that the Communist Party had board members on, Shanghai Turbine Company, Shanghai Generator Company. They arguably represent the employees. In private enterprise driven model of this country to this point, boards represent the owning constituents and what the value proposition they're seeking by investing in the institution is. Not so much represent the employees. We have unions who represent employees. We have other ways that they're represented through our very fair labor laws, and trustee boards aren't meant really to do that as much as manage and govern to the goals and objectives of those state governments that put money into them, the public ones, and the students who pay to attend. So if you get very distilled down to focusing on the mission of the institution for the primary constituents who provided funding, not vendors, unfortunately not employees, but those who provided funding for its very existence, and forming a strategy around that, and training done by a higher level from those who fund the enterprises, it would be a far better thing. So the objectivity of decisions and assistance provided by boards can be so much greater, where they do have some sensitivity training from those who are supporting the very notion of a board existing. That tends to be those who are paying for the enterprise.
So I just wanted to add here that ACTA's Institute for Effective Governance does offer this type of training to governing boards. We're looking at starting with the institutional mission and keeping that educational mission first. So I just wanted to really close out before we go to Q&A. One final question for everybody. And really it's what are the solutions that you see that should be coming from the institutional level to make college more affordable without sacrificing quality? And Amy, I'd like to start with you, just kind of start with the big picture.
Sure. I mean, I think schools need to figure out who they're serving and make sure they're serving them well. And, if that means, as I was saying earlier, changing some of their program offerings, if that means looking at all of their contracts, because some of the things that we have seen and heard about are things like, reassessing how their parking contracts work, or utilizing their buildings year round, or, renting out their buildings in order to save some of the money on the heating and cooling costs, or whatever it is. Thinking creatively, and frankly, to the extent you can, working together. And I know, everyone's in competition with each other and things like that, but there are some schools that are out there that I think are trying to do the best and trying to keep their costs low and trying to put, frankly, students first in terms of making sure that students can get in and get the education that they need and the experience that they want, and then get out. I think it's having those hard conversations. I think it's working with the board and working among all of you to think about where you've seen costs increasing and having some tough conversations, and involving, to the extent you can, involving faculty and all of that too. Because if you come up with what we have heard from folks, you come up with great ideas, and then it goes out to the faculty, particularly when you're talking about some of the administrative bloat and reforming, reassessing how departments and things are run or formed, or all of that. And things kind of have a tendency to blow up if they feel like they're not part of the process.
So I think you asked the right question, Armand, about, keeping things affordable while at least maintaining the quality of an institution. And one of the things that has emerged in the work that we did on trustee best practices is when you pair a tuition freeze with other tools that help the institution maintain that quality. I don't think it's sufficient for the industry to say, for those affordability advocates like myself and others, to say, hey, well, just sort of choke off tuition, right? Because, every state and institution is different, and, that could be really detrimental in certain scenarios. And I think what we really, for example, like is what they're doing in Illinois. While they have maintained about a 7-year tuition freeze across the University of Illinois system, they also have employed a self-help tool for the institutions. And that is really the one-of-a-kind program level cost survey of all of their institutions, which is really deeply impressive. And the chair of the University of Illinois Board of Trustees said to me, quote, "You can't control your costs if you don't know what they are," end quote. And so what this survey allows them to do is to aid the institutions with information about their cost drivers at the program department level, and allow them to make smarter decisions about where to spend their money, how to set a proper budget. And so I think that's really important. Another thing that we saw that worked very well for the Florida system, notwithstanding the performance of an individual institution, is pairing tuition freeze with accountability around funding. So not just funding and saying, hey, we're giving you your allocation based on some front end measure like enrollment, but something on the back end related to outcomes. So it's an incentive for the institutions to perform in certain areas, while at the same time knowing that they're not going to be able to simply tell students that they're going to have to pay more because that's been the tradition over time.
Can I add?
Please.
Let me add to that. The one thing that was the most difficult thing to do, but that really kept us within our budget, was every year evaluating what classes we're going to teach and which ones we aren't. If the demand went away, we'd have to let them go. If you just don't have enough people subscribing to 18th century French poetry, that course goes. And so on a constant basis, every year we were eliminating classes that we might have taught the previous year just because of demand. We had to be efficient in what we were offering. It was very painful to faculty, but it was for us, it was extremely important in terms of maintaining efficiencies in what we were able to do with a limited budget.
Dave, last word.
The selection of programming is massively important, and I defend others in the SUS system. Florida State University has a marvelous homily inside the provost webpage reminding his institution that the long-term cost of a tenure decision by the board of trustees, by management, is about $2.2 million a year, not per year, but over the life of that given tenure decision. So decisions like that come to boards that should include, and here they have to by statute, and that's a very good thing in Florida, should involve, in part, an economic analysis of research recovery, because tenured faculty is all about research. And to the extent of 5/8 of time spent per year, that's kind of how it's programmed. Therefore, the recovery anticipated in these additional commitments on researchers needs evaluated by boards in making often consent agenda decisions to en masse approve this year's 60, 70 or so new tenure uplifts. What is the recovery coming from the justification into the institution from those added positions? Things like that in economic sense. But there has been some progress with it, especially here, Florida State, with moving ahead with reminding its board and management on how critical these long-term decisions are. Programming also, of course, is very important to be responsive to the regional community's hiring proclivity and what job creation is going on and what areas are hotter than others. Maybe psychology is maybe not the best area, maybe mechanical engineering, perhaps accounting, perhaps IT proficiency can drive more job creation for the community, which is, again, one of the core missions of a state institution. So not just looking at the enrollment level per section, but also the employability. In most of our SUS schools, 72% of students who graduate don't go beyond a BS degree or an undergraduate degree. Wind up working and using that skills acquired for a career, the development of a career, and not an academic one. So employability massively important in evaluating, in part, what degree programs are offered.
Well put. And thank you all. Congressman Davis, I think you hit the nail on the head, though, with the word painful. I mean, these are often very difficult decisions, but they're ones that come from strong leadership. So at this point, I'd like to go into the Q&A section. I think we have a few questions in the queue. Just as a reminder to everyone, if you'd like to submit a question to the panel, we have the Q&A button at the bottom. Feel free, and we'll get to as many as we can today. So Nick, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, we do have quite a few. So first, what is the singular best book or resource that incorporates all of the tools that everybody has talked about today? Is there a university that would fully open, or that would fully open budgets and could be considered a best practice? This person who asked the question has compiled information from ACTA, NACUO, and EAB resources, as well as read chapters from a lot of books and online resources like How Colleges Spend Money. Her university is about to revise the budgeting process, but they don't seem to have access to the right tools. The finance and provost staff seem to have very limited bandwidth to read even one academic article or academic book.
Anyone want to take a stab at that?
Well, I don't think there's one single source, unfortunately. And, I'm so pleased that ACTA would sponsor this session today. The collaboration between what our organization and their organization has done, I think, has been very useful in standing in some of that gap that you mentioned. So just to plug our project, we have a ongoing project that's currently in the wrap-up stage called the Best Practices for College Trustees, on college affordability for trustees. And that is a 5 case studies of institutions employing different strategies. And, you talk about an important one, budgeting. There's not a single resource. Please, pay attention to our project page and also ACTA's resources. But I'm not aware of a single source, and I think that's part of the real problem here, is that there's not one single authority on how to solve these problems. We're trying to grow the number of resources in this area, and I know ACTA is committed to that as well.
And I just want to add that ACTA, we are at your service. We actually have a crack research team here. And so if there are any issues in regard to budgeting, finance that are not on our website, there's a lot of stuff we have under the hood. We can look at Department of Education data. We can find other data sources that are related. So it's not just limited to what you find on the website. I mean, feel free to reach out. I mean, we are at your service, even just on an informal basis.
If I might add to that, and I'm going to put in a shared plug for the ACTA cost of attendance studies, just fantastically useful. We get into them a year and a half ago, incredibly useful. Also, even within a state, or looking at best practices across other, for example, against state institutions here, University of Florida, Florida State, among smaller SUS system schools, University of North Florida, generally some really excellent processes and practices, for example, in distance learning, at assuring that students have choice, whether they want a section, if they're enrolled full-time in, whether it's distance or Zoomed or face-to-face, they get to choose what they're getting ahead of time. Those schools have done some good work on containing enrollment to an affordable level. And, there are some ways of looking at the way they behave, in terms of getting lessons learned. So I'd submit to everybody in your state or region, look at institutions that are really developing the best practices and maybe the best way of looking at their value deliverable, whether it's class size, which is really important, or how much freedom students have to choose internet courses versus face-to-face. Do they have freedom to pick between them, or are they mandated on them? Things of that nature. You can make an assessment of what practices are in place at many places that are way worth following.
Okay, I actually think that's a good segue into another question we have here, and this is to anybody on the panel. Can you identify which areas of administrative bloat are trending now? Would it be building expenses, or overbuilding, or perks for students, such as the infamous LSU Lazy River, or recreational amenities? Does anything jump out at you that might seem a little out of the ordinary, or just too much?
I mean, I can start from the Hill perspective. I know the student amenities always catch members' attention. Those always show up in various news articles. And so even though, some of them have come out, some of them have been privately funded and things like that, those are always fodder for folks to highlight and as concerns, because, why are they building this? And it's always a, race with their competitors and things like that. I think that, and then just random kind of overstaffing, I think, of departments, and kind of just the creation of all the multitude of levels of, dean, assistant dean, assistant dean, those types of things. members take a very strong look at. And then I would also say any of the kind of research centers on campus or offices that have started on campus that don't really produce anything or, just aren't contributing at all to student learning or student growth. Those are all the things that I think I hear about a lot from members.
Let me add to that. I think every university has some centers that aren't helping with growth. They might be designed, you might hire somebody high priced who's a researcher to come in. They don't always work out. Just like in business, sometimes you'll spend money and it doesn't work out well. Look, the highest paid member in any university staff is generally the football coach, or George Mason, it's the basketball coach. You don't hear a lot of complaints about that, but the amount of money that goes into this is incredible. And the fact that football tends to be a moneymaker in many of these schools and basketball tends to be a moneymaker, give them a sort of a pass. But the spending in these areas is quite high compared to, I think, the academics, that you're trying to achieve.
I want to take this opportunity to give a shout out to one of our case studies, Jack Hawkins, who is the oldest tenured president of an American college or university at Troy University. And he's the chancellor of Troy University. This is a very grounded institution. And he was telling me that they had recently sold off a building. And I thought that was something worth celebrating, because we hear so much in the industry about how institutions are really amassing, they're amassing property, they're amassing infrastructure. It's not necessarily core to the business. And Dr. Hawkins told me this story recently about how they had recognized an opportunity where a facility that they had, which was on one of their campuses, was no longer maximized. The facility wasn't maximized, and they thought that the best situation for that facility was to sell it off in the open market, and they did that, and they recouped money for it, and it's not on their books anymore. Pulling down their budget. So there are, going back to the point where there are bright spots in higher education, and we need to make sure to collect those stories and tell those tales so that more colleges and university board members and presidents see themselves in those stories and say, hey, it's not just Mitch Daniels out there, as stellar as Mitch Daniels is, but we can do it too, because this university over there is doing it, and this one over in that corner of the woods is doing it.
Ron, I wanted to add that Amy made a number of great points today. One was the facility utilization always being evaluated for capacity utilization when new CapEx programs are recommended. It always needs to be a robust, make good process on, hey, how about our existing stock of facilities that we maybe tend to be using between Tuesday and Thursday? Can we not find ways to think more openly and more 360 degrees about using existing facilities far more fully and extracting utilization out of low utilization facilities before investing in new ones, which I think was a great point. I saw that quite a bit. And secondly, again, the notion of CapEx spending on core mission activities, especially in a world of scarce resources among states or public institutions, where, for example, while it may sound egalitarian and wonderful to be building a solar farm, and then come to find out, of course, an institution that might build one would be spending $160 a watt, compared to the utility might be spending $100 per watt for the same facility in the same region. Well, is it a public policy good for a college or university to be spending 60% more than the utility does building the same capacity, where the institution would be spending on teaching, instruction, research facilities, and more core mission things? So there are multi-layers of ways, but I think the notion of capacity utilization of existing facilities always being looked at in the context of requests for new ones is really very useful way to think about things.
Really well put, and I think a fitting place for us to conclude our conversation today. Thank you so much to all of our guests and to all of you who joined us today. Please, let's keep this conversation going. Feel free to reach out. You can visit our website at goacta.org and also at howcollegesspendmoney.com. Looking forward to seeing you all again soon. Be well all.
Thank you.